Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this very sensible orange StuG III. This is the Tamiya 1/48th scale model I built a while ago. If you would like to see the build video for this vehicle, there's a link in the description and in the upper right corner of the screen now. So, why paint a StuG orange? Well, I have a StuG III in War Thunder to which I've applied orange decals, the result of which I quite liked. Unless I've forgotten or gotten lazy while editing, there should be a brief clip of that on screen now. I'm well aware this model isn't exactly the same as the one in the game, but really, I don't care, and I'm sure most of you don't either. This is clearly a fun paint scheme rather than an attempt at replicating anything. Well, except a video game assault gun. Enough jibber jabber, let's have a look at what I did. I started by priming. No surprises there. In this case, I've used AK Interactive Waterborne Polymer Grey Primer. Partly because I had no black primer left, but mostly because I figured it would be much easier to paint orange over a light coloured primer. Then I base coated with a mix of roughly 2 parts Vallejo model colour Amarantha Red to 1 part model colour light orange. I'm obviously airbrushing this on, but you could do it with a paintbrush as well. I did a couple of light coats of it, which is much better than a single heavy coat. Some people don't seem to realise, but multiple thin coats is always better than one thick heavy coat. The reason I made this mix is because I didn't have a single orange colour that I felt would be right for this model. That would have obviously been more convenient, but don't be afraid to mix colours so they're what you want. It's not an exact match for the colour of the StuG in-game, but I didn't really want to spend the time arsing about trying to replicate that. I just wanted something that was close enough and appealing to me. Then I airbrush a highlight using plain model colour light orange. I spray this mostly from above, though I do also hit the sides a little bit. The idea here is to create the look of both faded paint and sunlight shining down on top of the vehicle. It's pretty simple, but it does add a little something to the base coat. At first, I wasn't entirely sure I liked this, and I did consider stripping it back and restarting it. At this stage, that's not such a big deal. Anyway, I let it sit for a day or two while I pondered, and I decided that this would be fine. Then it's time for another highlight. This time I'm using my makeup brush. I'll link a video about this brush in the description. The colour I'm using here is a mix of roughly 3 parts light orange to 1 part model colour German orange. I didn't think either of them on their own would have looked quite right. As you can see, I'm dry brushing this onto the sharp corners and raised edges and things like that. This should help make all the details and edges kind of pop and stand out a bit more than they normally would. I'm not trying to be super neat or anything like that, but I'm not trying to be messy either. I did spend a bunch of time umming and ahhing whether or not I should add a wash over this. I was considering using maybe a red wash, but I decided it would be better left as is, with no wash. So I moved on and applied a bit of gloss varnish in places where I want to apply the decals. And then, when that had cured, I applied the decals. My War Thunder orange StuG doesn't have markings, they're hidden by the decal that makes it orange, but I thought on the model having decals would make it a bit more interesting. Because I'm a bit of a dunderhead, I've misplaced the decals that came with this kit, but that's okay. Unlike with my last set of misplaced decals, I can still continue with the project. The Tamiya sheet didn't come with anything unique that I was going to use anyway. All I needed is a couple of crosses. Balkenkreuz? I'm not entirely sure how to say that. These came from a Warlord set. I also arbitrarily decided to use this marking for the 2nd SS Panzer Division, just to add some interest. Did the 2nd SS Panzer use the StuG? Who cares? I'm clearly not going for historical accuracy here. Cue the hordes of angry German fanboys. Get off my lawn. Next comes the chipping, because of course doing this before the decals would rob us of the opportunity to weather them into the base coat of the vehicle. On the real thing, the markings are painted on and get weathered along with the rest of the paint. I apply this in pretty much exactly the same way that I usually do. If you want a more in-depth look at this, I've linked a video about it in the description. The colour I've used here is almost the same as usual, but it's a bit different. It's roughly 70% Vallejo model colour black grey to 30% model colour mahogany, which is what I would normally use, more or less. But this time I figured I might try adding a little bit of model air steel. I would say roughly 1 part steel to 10 to 12 parts of the black grey mahogany mix. I did this because the War Thunder model has a lot of bright, shiny scratches and spots of worn off paint. I don't exactly want that, I don't really like that look. Real metal doesn't stay shiny like that for very long. But, because I am trying to make this look similar to the in-game model, I thought I might try it with the hope of adding a tiny bit of a sheen to the chipped areas, without being excessively shiny. You can barely notice it, but I'm okay with that. Then, using the same colour mix and a fine brush, I add some longer scratches and a few smaller chips in areas I couldn't get to with the foam. This is pretty simple. Next, why not paint the tracks? I used model colour black grey here because why not? This is obviously fairly straightforward. I apply the colour to the track links, and not the places I don't want this colour. That's the secret. It's also a good idea to use the bigger brush for the bigger areas, and then step down to a smaller brush to get in around the wheels and sprockets. I also painted the towing cables with this colour as a base coat, again, because why not? Having this part separate ensures that it's really quick and easy to do. I think I was initially planning to airbrush these cables, but it didn't really seem worth the setup and cleanup just to do this one small part, so I used a brush. Then I highlighted the cables with a dry brushing of roughly 2 parts model colour gunmetal to 1 part model air black. Obviously this is after the base coat had dried. I used the same colour mix to paint all the metal parts of the tools around the StuG. Again, like the tracks, the trick is to put the colour only where you want it, which does involve taking your time and being careful. It is of course okay to make mistakes, but it is a bit inconvenient to have to fix them later, so I always do my best to get it right the first time. I mean, who doesn't do that really? Anyway, I painted all the things that I think might be metal. Maybe I've painted some wooden bars metallic or left some metal bars to be painted wood, but I think what I've done looks fine anyway. Then I use plain model colour gunmetal to add a highlight to some of the upper areas of the tools. It's a bit shiny, but not too shiny. At any rate, it'll be dulled down further when the final matte coat is applied. I normally don't like excessive shiny metallics on my tanks. I then dry brushed this colour onto the towing cables, and then I figured it might make sense to paint the end loopy bits with it as well. They don't stand out too much, but they do stand out. After that, I make a mix of Amarantha Red and light orange. Like the base coat, this is 2 parts Amarantha Red and 1 part light orange. I'm trying to get this quite close to the base colour, but it doesn't have to be perfect. I use it to paint the clips that hold the cables onto the engine deck. And then I thought why not use it to apply some slight damage to the decals. This is so it looks as though only the paint of the marking has been scratched, but not the underlying paint. I only did a tiny bit of this because I didn't want to go overboard. I also use it to correct any mistakes I can find, particularly the bands around the fire extinguisher and the areas around the tools. Really anywhere I've got colours on the orange that I don't want to be there. Next, I apply a wash of army painted dark tone to the metal parts of the tools and cables. This was thinned roughly 2 parts dark tone to 1 part water. I'm trying not to go too heavily on the tools, and I do soak some of it back up with the brush where I've applied too much. Though it is okay to have a little bit of spillage with this. It should just look like a stain or some dirt or something. On the cables, I just kind of slapped it on roughly and fairly heavily. There's no real need to be careful here. I then painted the wooden parts of the tools. For this, I used Vallejo model colour Beige Brown. As with the metal parts, I'm trying to be neat and careful here to avoid having to do touch-ups. This isn't too hard. At this scale, the parts are fairly big, especially in comparison to 15mm or even 28mm stuff that I usually paint. Like I said before, I'm not totally sure that everything I'm painting as wood is actually wood on the real thing, but I think I've got it close enough, and I'm not going back to change it if I haven't. Then I highlighted the wooden handles and poles using model colour Iraqi Sand. I mostly apply this along the upper edges and I'm trying to be a little bit rough with it, but not too much. I probably should have done this before the previous touch-ups with the orange, but whatever. I'll just have to try not to make mistakes. Everything will be fine. Next, I paint the end of what I'm assuming to be the gun cleaning brush. I did this with model colour Basalt Grey. Nothing much to this really, just make sure to paint as far around the part as you can. It would look kind of silly only to paint this on the outward facing edge. Once that had dried, I apply a bit of army painted dark tone, just to darken it down and add a little bit of interest. I think it worked pretty well. I don't know how realistic it is, but I'm not too worried about that anyway. I am after all painting this orange. Then I used Army Painter Strong Tone thinned roughly 50-50 with water and apply it to the wooden parts I just painted. Of course I have left the paint to dry before doing this. This is pretty simple, but I feel like it adds quite a lot to the woody parts of the tools. Hehe, he said woody. I then painted the road wheels and return rollers. Well, not the entire wheel, just the rubber parts. I used AK Interactive rubber tyres here, which I feel like is a pretty nice colour, and I'm trying to be quite neat here, but for whatever reason, mostly incompetence, I did it quite messily. I did manage to avoid the inner parts of the wheels, but I made a fair mess of the rims. That's okay, it can always be touched up later. While I was in the middle of painting the tyres, I thought it might be fun to paint a couple of the road wheels a different colour. I painted these wheels using Vallejo model colour Middlestone to represent Dunkelgelb. These are to represent the StuG having lost 2 wheels and having had to replace them with wheels from another vehicle, one that wasn't painted orange, if you can believe such a vehicle would exist. The model doesn't have any spares on it, so I thought this made sense. I then dry brushed a highlight on those 2 wheels with a 50-50 mix of Middlestone and buff. This is a pretty simple downward dry brushing. I didn't bother adding any chipping to this, so we're just going to pretend that it's a near new wheel. It will get some weathering later on anyway, just no chipping. I think that might help it stand out a bit too. You can see I did get a bit of the dry brushing on the track links. That's okay, I simply touch it up again with model colour black grey. Obviously I finished painting the tyres, and then I tidied up the wheel rims. I made yet another mix of 2 parts Amarantha Red and 1 part light orange. This is where you should be as careful as you can. These are corrections, and it's kind of annoying to have to make corrections to your corrections. But if they need to be done, they do need to be done, I suppose. This isn't really too hard. The rim is raised and fairly hard to miss. I may have made it sound a bit more dramatic than it was. Seems reasonably neat. It's definitely not perfect, but some wash around the wheels should take care of it. At this point I figured it would be a nice idea to add some gunmetal to the outer rim of the idler wheel and on the teeth of the drive sprocket. This is of course quite a shiny colour. These areas would be worn to a sheen, but at this stage it's still a tiny bit shiny for my tastes, but the matte varnish at the end will dull this down significantly, so this is fine. Then I take some Vallejo model colour mahogany and paint the exhausty bits. I may be wrong in my assumption that these large objects I'm painting are mufflers, but I'm pretty sure the little pipes coming out of them are exhausts at least. I used this mahogany because I feel like it's a good base for rust, which I'll apply later. And that's about all I felt I needed to do with the acrylics. So I applied a coat of gloss varnish in preparation for the enamel weathering layers. Now that the tank is all shiny, I apply AK Interactive Track Wash to the tracks. Makes sense, right? This is clearly pretty simple. Simply put it onto the tracks. Just like the grey acrylic colour underneath, not putting it on the other areas is the trick. This stuff will more or less settle and kind of thin out into the lower areas just a little bit, which I find helps to add a little bit of colour variation. I do rather like this track wash. Next, I use some AK Interactive Dark Brown Wash for green vehicles. This doesn't seem to be a green vehicle, but it should still work fine. I thinned this stuff roughly 3 parts wash to 1 part thinner. The thinner I'm using is white spirits I got from an artist's supply. Much cheaper than using the teeny tiny bottles of it that you get from AK Interactive and the like. Anyway, I'm putting this around all the gaps, hinges and other details, and I'm doing it quite roughly as you can see. It looks like a garbagey mess while doing this, but that's okay. I applied a bunch of this to the big flat side of the lower hull, using the thinner to thin it out on the model. This will obviously make it look much dirtier and a bit darker, hopefully giving a bit more depth to the model. I also apply it to the wheels, and as you can see I'm using thinners to, well, thin. I apply and remove this colour until I'm satisfied with it. That's one of the advantages of using enamels. Easy removal, as long as you protect the stuff underneath that you want to keep with a varnish. Speaking of cleanup, I'm using a cotton swab and an old brush which has become stiff, and some clean thinner to remove the bits of dark brown wash that I don't want, which is quite a bit of it. You can see how easily the enamel comes up. You can pretty much do this as many times as you want until you're happy with the result. The end result is a lot neater, but still pretty dirty and well used looking. I then applied a rough dabbing of AK Interactive rust streaks to the muffler and exhausts. This is deliberately a little patchy so that it looks like rust. I did consider adding a lighter rust colour as well, but I figured the model is orange enough anyway, and this kind of breaks that up a little bit. Because I'm satisfied with what I've got so far, I add another layer of gloss varnish, and then I added the towing cables. Then I figure it's time for a little bit of mud and dirt. I used some AK Interactive dark mud and put it around the running gear and hull side. In some areas I apply the thinner first, and then the colour. Others I add the colour first and then the thinner. It's kind of random. I smear this around, trying to avoid making it look brushed on. I'm not being precise with it at all, and I'm trying not to go too heavy, but I do particularly want the sides of the hull to be pretty dirty. I apply this to the wheels too, but I'm going a lot lighter with it than on the side of the hull. I'm not going for super heavy mud here, more like light splashes of more liquidy mud, rather than chunky mud. I also put this on the lower rear and front of the hull too, because, well, that makes sense. Then, in an attempt to simulate splattering, I take a toothbrush, obviously an old one that I've already been using with paint, and I sort of flick the dark mud up onto the model from below. You should definitely put something behind the model if you're doing this and you want to keep paint off whatever's at the back of your work area. In my case, I don't want paint on or in my shrimp tank. I repeat the toothbrush splattering with AK Interactive Summer Kursk Earth. This is thinned roughly 50-50 with White Spirit. I want to do this kind of lightly, so I remove the first couple of flicks worth of paint before applying it to the model. The idea with this colour was just to add a bit of variation and interest to the mud that I've already got there, not to overpower it. I think it looks pretty decent, but I want to remove it from a couple of areas like the mufflers, and I do this with a brush with some clean thinner on it. I also lightly brush this downwards in some areas of the hull to simulate the effect of rain and cause some streaking. This is meant to be very liquidy mud, so there would be a bit of dripping. Then, to try and add just a bit more interest and variation, I add some AK Interactive engine grime around the torsion bar arm things and other suspensiony bits. Clearly these aren't engines, but who says you can only use the paint on the parts it's named for? Not me, I'm a rebel. I thin it on the model and add more and remove it until I'm satisfied with it. It'll probably barely be visible, but it is there. I also use this colour to darken down the inside of these vents, I guess they're air vents, and I apply a tiny bit of it to the towing cables, for reasons. It's not obviously noticeable really, but subtle effects are nice. At this point I wasn't really sure if I was done, or if adding more might be going too far. I do often have trouble with this. I think a lot of people do. I applied another coat of gloss varnish, just in case I decided to add some more enamels. All I could think to do was add a bit of exhaust soot, so I did that with my airbrush, but for whatever reason I didn't hit record on the camera. After that I applied AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. As a finishing touch I take a graphite stick and run it along the raised parts of the tracks. This is just to add a little hint of shine where they've been worn by the tank moving. You could use a pencil too, as I've done in the past, but these sticks were cheap and seemed like they'd be convenient. This was the first time I'd used them. The graphite does get on your fingers, so do wash your hands after using them, or you'll get graphite where you don't want it. And with that, the very sensible orange StuG is complete. As I probably mentioned at the start of the video, this is the Tamiya StuG III in 1/48th scale, which is a pretty good model in my opinion. It's kind of hard to go wrong with Tamiya. And of course the build video is linked in the description and probably in the end card. So, this isn't exactly a common way to paint one of these vehicles. It's obviously going to stand out in pretty much any theatre of war, which you don't really want for an assault gun, or any vehicle really. Well, maybe you do, I wouldn't. But it does look fairly similar to the one I have in War Thunder, and I'm pretty happy with it. I can see things I might do differently were I to paint this again, but I think that's always the case. Observing and evaluating our work is certainly part of the hobby that we should all be doing. That's how we improve. I'm pretty satisfied with this end result. I am especially glad I painted those two wheels Dunkelgelb. I think it adds quite a bit of interest and story, though I must admit I'm a little tempted to keep tinkering with it. And I may well do that. Maybe not. Sometimes it's best to leave well enough alone. This might be one of the dirtiest looking models I've ever painted. I do normally prefer a cleaner look. It's even a little bit cleaner than the in-game version I've based it on, though it does still look fairly muddy. Not in the sense that it's been churning up fields and getting coated in super chunky mud, it's more like thin, watery mud that might be found around a flooded over road or something like that. I suppose I could have applied some chunky mud, and at this scale I wouldn't really mind that, but I decided against it. I don't usually like big detail obscuring lumps of mud, but that's mostly because in smaller scales it looks kind of out of place in my opinion. This model is in a scale where that wouldn't be so bad. Most of the mud and dirt is focused on the lower areas of the StuG. I figure maybe it hasn't been moving fast enough to flick the mud up too high, and it's probably been raining. But mostly I just didn't want to obscure all the orange paint, plus that's how it looks in game anyway. So, rambling aside, I'm pretty happy with the result I've got here. Surely there's going to be somebody who doesn't get it and will be upset about the unrealistic colours, but that sounds like a them problem to me. I think it's fun, and if you're not having fun in your hobby, I'm pretty sure you're doing it wrong. I don't expect this is something most people are going to be that eager to replicate, but if for some reason you want to know, there's a list of paints I've used in the description below. So, what do you think? Is Orange StuG best StuG? Have you painted something like this yourself? If you have, I'd like to see it. Let me know, along with any other comments or questions you might have, in the comments section below. Comments in the comments section? What a concept! Also, don't forget to subscribe, follow, ring the bell, and all the other things you do on YouTube and social media. If you really like the things I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon, or by purchasing a shirt or mug from my merch store. Links to all of the things in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon. So until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.